All right, Fifth and Long fans, welcome back to the pod. Got a special guest today, John Kocsis, the voice of the Columbia Fireflies minor league baseball team in Columbia, South Carolina, the home of yours truly. John is also a diehard Cleveland sports fan. He's from Cleveland, if I'm not mistaken, or thereabouts, right?
Yeah, about 15 minutes outside the city.
Okay, cool. And if I'm not mistaken, you were actually in Cleveland over the holidays, right?
Yes, sir. I made sure I could stick along for that Browns Jets game, and the next morning I drove out to Columbia.
Were you actually in person at the game?
No, I was with a bunch of family members, and we were just all watching, cheering along. Sometimes I feel like that intimate gathering of like 15, 20 people is just as fun as going out to a stadium and stuff, especially when you don't, because I'm 700 miles away, you don't get to see the family so much. But I mean, I saw some of the videos and the photos of the bridge going to the Muni lot and stuff online. It was mayhem downtown. So
Yeah, let's get right into that because obviously the Browns now have clinched a playoff berth. They're second in the last, 20, 30 years, something along those lines.
you could phrase it like that, right? It was this year and then 2020, and then the last time before 2020 was 2002. So yeah, it's one way to say it is it's the second in the last 20 years. It's also the second in the last 3 years.
And that 2020 season, Baker Mayfield was still the quarterback then. That was an AFC championship game run, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it fell just a little bit short in Kansas City, I believe.
I think it was the second round. So it was they beat Pittsburgh, like they shellacked them by like 20 or something in the wild card game. And I think it was the next week. It was a one possession game against Kansas City, and there was the fumble at the goal line after the helmet to helmet contact that everyone always shows on. I think I saw it during the Jets game like 3 times. They brought up that Kansas City game. So yeah, I mean, it was a close game, and it was, you go to the AFC Championship game. I can't remember who Kansas City played that year, but it was like a rollover game at that point, and then the Super Bowl was another real game.
Yeah, I'm looking at the box score of that game now. 22-17 Chiefs over the Browns, a one possession game. Brutal end of the season. Baker Mayfield actually had 467 passing yards in the playoffs, 4 touchdowns as well. So he showed up.
Yeah, that was
But
the anything is possible game. That was Patrick Mahomes goes out with like a sprained ankle or something in the second or third quarter, and then Hennessy comes in, and Hennessy pioneered the game-winning drive for that. He scores a touchdown with like 3 minutes left in the game or something.
yeah, I remember that. He had that diving touchdown kind of near the pylon where he got nailed, and then everybody thought he was hurt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they were like, "Well, what do we do? Do we throw a punter?" I think it was Britton Colquitt at that point.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I remember that game was on CBS, 4 o'clock window, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
37-20, the final score, the Browns beating the New York Jets in Cleveland. What's the buzz like in the city around this team? Obviously, Cleveland, I mean, the Indians had the World Series run. LeBron obviously had his stretch of runs to the finals as well. But since then, Cleveland hasn't had a ton of sports things happening, I feel like, or no successes quite like this. So put me in the shoes of a Cleveland Browns fan, a Clevelandite, however you want to say it, and just talk to me about how the city is embracing this team and what the vibe is like around town.
Yeah, I mean the Guardians, Indians, however you want to look at it, they've been so good for so long. Where it was, I think it was 2 years ago, it's the first time they missed the playoffs since like 2013 or something. So for a while, it was just, hey, consistently this is going to be a playoff team. But after 2016, there were no deep playoff runs. It was you lose to the Yankees in the first or the second round, or you lose to the Astros in the first or the second round. That's kind of how the tribe have played since 2017. Then obviously the last 2 years were so polar opposite. You had the wild card team that was the youngest team in baseball beat. I believe they knocked off Seattle, and then they played New York that next round. And this last year, I mean, the pitching staff just got beat up early, and they were bad. So that was kind of the one team Cleveland could hang their hat on. The Cavs are, again, really young, same fit as the Guardians. Last year, they made the playoffs for the first time without LeBron since, I don't know, I think Brad Daugherty was still on the team and Mark Price, the old NBA Jam teams of the 90s. So, those two teams kind of are giving you a little bit of hope, but Cleveland is such a football blue collar town. You know, as much as anyone will tell you, man, we love the Guardians. Oh man, we love the Cavs. Like when the Browns do well, I mean, when the Browns are 0-16, they're still selling out games, right? You don't see Progressive Field sold out on a Tuesday in July. Even when the team's doing super well after that 90s run, you haven't seen it. And then, I mean, when the Cavs are bad, there's 3,000 people in that stadium at the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. But when the Browns are bad, they're still supported, and when they're good, man, it's crazy. And I think so many people, particularly early in the season, wanted to beat on Kevin Stefanski. They're like, man, this guy sucks. I can't tell you how many Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, you know, social media from people in high school, social media from people back home saying Stefanski's the worst coach ever. You know, you have Chubb go out week 2. You've got Myles Garrett beat up. You've got Anthony Walker beat up, Amari Cooper beat up, and Deshaun Watson's missing 6 games. When he's playing, you're getting wins, but it's not because Deshaun Watson's playing well, right? He's got one 300-yard game in 12 games. And then this guy named Joe Flacco comes in, and I think people are starting to believe anything is possible. I mean, he's 4-1. He's throwing 300 some yards a game. His second game, he had the most yards since like 2021. Jacoby Brissett had a 350-yard game against Indianapolis, and it's kind of crazy to think about it, but he's now done that 4 straight games, right? The Rams game is the only game that he has thrown for less than 300 yards. And yeah, he's making his share of mistakes, but you really, with that defense, only need a game manager. And I think people are starting to see, hey, Joe Flacco could be our Trent Dilfer for the 2003 Ravens Super Bowl ring. It just depends on if this defense can stay healthy.
And I would even say Trent Dilfer might be doing Joe a little bit of a disservice. You highlighted 4 straight games with 300 plus yards. He's had 3 touchdown passes in 3 of those games. He's also had his share of interceptions as well, which you mentioned, 7 of them over the last 4 games, but 7 picks to 11 touchdown passes. He's thrown for over 1,200 yards, approaching 1,400 actually in that span. That's a short time frame to put up numbers like that. And this brings me to my next question. Where does Joe Flacco rank as far as Cleveland Browns quarterbacks just in your lifetime? So I'm not trying to go all the way back to like Bernie Kosar and those guys, because that was quite a long time ago. Otto Graham even played in like from the 40s to the 50s, but neither you or I were around for that time period. Are there other guys that you can even really – that's a tough question to ask because of how many guys have played under center for you in the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, I think Kelly Holcomb is probably the best quarterback since they came back in 99. Unfortunately, he shattered his hip in his second season, but he's the guy that brought him to that 2002 playoff run. I think Tim Couch was really good. He just had a really bad team around him. I mean, we saw what he did at Kentucky. He's glorified in Lexington, right? But he came to Cleveland, and there was a couple big moments. He threw a Hail Mary against the Saints in like 2000 or 2001, and you could see the guy had a cannon. He just never had any time in the pocket. Baker, you know, you can hate him as much as you want. Baker is probably a top 3 quarterback since the Browns have come back. And I really think, I mean, when he was healthy, and he's shown it again in Tampa Bay, when he's healthy, I don't know that he's a Pro Bowl quarterback, but he's good enough if you have a good team around him to get the job done. And that's why I said with Deshaun Watson, I was very against getting Deshaun Watson first, because that salary is ridiculous, right? Like you're taking up a third of your cap on one player, and you're talking about having an elite defense. You're talking about having Nick Chubb, Amari Cooper. It's only so many dollars and cents to go around. It doesn't make sense for a guy that had that controversy, for a guy that hadn't played in 18 months at that time, to come to your team. But I mean, we're seeing it with Joe Flacco, right? A guy that's, you know, $2.5 million contract with a bunch of incentives. What makes it really interesting is next year's the year that contract for Deshaun actually like kicks in against the cap. Right now, this year, the Browns have the most cap in the NFL, which is kind of nuts to think about. But they're using that rule where half your cap left over can be added on to next year's cap. So CBA, Andrew Berry playing with numbers basically. But I mean, next year, can you hope to retain Joe Flacco as a backup, as a mentor, as a guy to even have a competition with Deshaun Watson because he's outplayed Watson? And I think the answer is no, right? Like I'd love to have him again, even in an incentive laden contract like right now, where it's 500 grand to win. In the playoffs, it's 750 grand to win, a million for a Super Bowl, I think. But like, you can't compete against Denver's going to offer him a contract. You're going to see maybe the Jets offer him a contract depending on how Rodgers' offseason goes, right? You're gonna see a lot of quarterback hungry teams, Carolina even, that might try and offer him a contract. And if you're asking me, hey, at 39, do you want to play for 10 million or 2 million? And unless I think that the Browns are going to give me that legacy Super Bowl win that maybe catapults me to the Hall of Fame, I think the answer is I go with the money, right?
You would have to think so. It certainly at Joe's stage in his career, that's something that you're going to have to think about. He did have quite a lucrative deal with the Ravens once upon a time, over $100 million.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it was what, 135?
Something around there. Something around there. I don't remember the exact number. You mentioned Baker Mayfield, who currently has the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in first place in the NFC South. Is it a nightmare scenario for you if the Browns end up playing the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl, or is that a chance at a little bit of like retribution almost?
So I guess I'll take you with my personal history. I wanted to draft Josh Allen that year so bad. I was actually in the booth in West Virginia during that draft, and I remember they were making fun of me. They were watching it in the video production room, and over the PA, like between innings, they're like, with the first overall pick in the NFL draft, the Cleveland Browns select. And then they're like hitting on the desk and stuff like that. Baker Mayfield. And so I was disappointed, but it was one of those things where I was happy to be wrong that Baker was going to be a good quarterback. I still think Allen's had a significantly better career, and I think in cold weather you want the big bodied guy that can run it, kind of like Ben Roethlisberger from Miami of Ohio instead of Charlie Fry, who the Browns picked that year, right? It's the same concept. You get that bigger bodied guy that embodies the tough physical run game you have to play in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Buffalo and Green Bay, Chicago. During that time of year, you just can't air it out every single play. But I think I root for Baker in the way of he didn't do anything wrong, right? He left on the team's terms, not his terms, and he was really good with the fan base. I remember he went to an Indians playoff game and shotgunned a beer and had a Lindor jersey on and was like pumping up the crowd during that playoff game. Like he was the quintessential, this could be the Browns quarterback, and he is the first playoff game winner, in over 20 years. So I can't hate the guy. If anything, you hope that this maybe spurns some wheels and get some things moving to say, okay, how can we fix Deshaun Watson and that whole situation? You can't get rid of the contract, but can you do something where you're spreading it out over time and making him cuttable or tradable or whatever it may be?
So another thing that was on my list after the win the other night, Kevin Stefanski, head coach of the Cleveland Browns, that the win against the Jets was his 37th as head coach of the Cleveland Browns, which broke him for a tie for third place in a Super Bowl era with most wins with Cleveland with Bill Belichick.
Yeah.
And the only other two coaches ahead of him, actually, in terms of wins in the Super Bowl era, don't have that many more than him. Marty Schottenheimer has 44. Sam Rutigliano has 47 as well. And Rutigliano didn't even have a winning record. He went 47-50 from 1978 to 1984. So, I mean, Stefanski, he's a solid bet for coach of the year. He's certainly going to be in the conversation this year with how much adversity this team has had to go through, losing both offensive tackles, losing Grant Delpit, losing Nick Chubb, 4 starting quarterbacks. That's not necessarily a recipe for double-digit wins and a 5 seed in the playoff race. Where do you hold Stefanski in terms of other coaches in the league? And do you think he has the respect and appreciation that he should deserve?
I'm finally starting to see the tides turn in Cleveland. Like when he went on that playoff run, I remember the playoff win in Pittsburgh, he had COVID for, so he was in his basement. He was not actually on the sideline. It was Mike Prefer, the special teams coach who was like calling plays that game. And I remember like a lot of people saying, man, the offense worked so well. And it was because Stefanski wasn't on the sideline. And I don't know, I've just always disagreed with that fundamentally. Like I've seen a lot of bad head coaches. I've seen Chud, I've seen Mangini, I've seen, I mean, even Butch Davis. Like Romeo Crennel gave us a couple of good years in 2005 to 2008, I think. But really, I haven't been in love with the head coach outside of Stefanski. Like Stefanski was a guy I wanted after seeing what he was able to do with an average Minnesota team. He comes over and immediately has to reshape the worst team in the NFL by far, and he was able to do it in a pretty quick amount of time. And the one thing I would say you could have against him was that his first defensive coordinator he hired, Woods, was bad. I mean, there's no other way to say it. When you got Myles Garrett, Denzel Ward, you've got Newsome on the other side of your secondary, John Johnson. I mean, there were so many good players on that team last year and 2 years ago to have such a bad defense. And you see Jim Schwartz comes in. I mean, you beef up that defensive line a little bit, but Za'Darius, he's only got 3 sacks. I mean, he's big on pressuring, but he's opening up holes for Shelby Harris, a guy that was already on the team. He's opening up holes for Ika, who is on the practice squad after being drafted. Like there are so many guys like Taki who are having impact years because of the way the schemes have changed. So, like he hitched himself to a bad defensive coordinator, but I think he's been really good. And to your point, ranking him among other head coaches, I think this is Campbell's year to win or lose the head coach of the year award. And I think it's solely based off your prior expectations. So I guess, Stefanski won coach of the year 4 years ago. Bill Belichick has won 2 coach of the years his entire career, right? So I don't think the academy, so to speak, likes giving it to people multiple times in a short stretch. As much as I think he's certainly in the top 3 there, I think, Campbell had a team that was really bad last year, and it's really good this year. And this is a Browns team that missed the playoffs by 2 games last year. So it was a team that was still good. It just became great. And I think you can credit Jim Schwartz a lot for the difference between being good and great. Now, when you look at a head coach, right, he's managing your other coaches. So yes, Stefanski made the hire. Stefanski trusted Schwartz and went through with that personnel switch. So it's certainly a credit to him too. It's nice seeing people finally start to like Stefanski in Cleveland, because I don't want to run out the best head coach we've had ever. But yeah, I don't think it's him this year. I think he finishes in the top 3. I think him, Harbaugh, and Campbell probably are the 3 that are going to be talked about, or maybe McDaniels as the 4th from Miami.
Win or lose come playoff time. Right now, the Browns are in the 5 seed. More likely than not, in the wild card round, Cleveland will have to face the AFC South champion. Who that will be is still yet to be determined. Could be Indianapolis, could be Jacksonville, could be Houston. Right now, Jacksonville is in that 4 seed, but they're going to be without Trevor Lawrence this weekend. Do you feel like you're playing with house money? I feel like that's a yes answer, but win or lose come playoff time, do you feel like this is already a successful season? So if, let's say you get to the divisional round like you did a couple of years ago, is that a success? Is that like, all right, we're back in the dance, this is where we want to be? Or are you expecting more coming from this? Because I would say you're definitely one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the AFC to me, and possibly even in that top 3. I mean, you look at some of the statistics, certainly defensively, you set the standard definitely in terms of pass defense. Right now, you're first in the league in opponent yards per game, first in opponent third down conversion percentage, first in opponent completion percentage allowed, first in opponent passing yards per game, first in opponent interceptions thrown percentage. Some of that may come to opponents. Some of that is just a testament to the talent of that defensive unit as a whole. Is this a team you think can legitimately make a Super Bowl run, or are you more content to see how the cards play out and just being in the playoffs is a win for you for this year?
Yeah, so week 1, it was Stefanski's got to make the playoffs or he's fired. That was like talk radio in Cleveland. That was the kind of local spotlight was, listen, we were in the playoffs in 2020. We've had back-to-back down years with nothing but excuses. First it was, hey, our quarterback's hurt, which is kind of funny based off how this year has worked. And then the second one was just, hey, we had a ton of bad breaks. We led the league in losses by a single possession. You got to figure out how to win those games, right? Good teams win single possession games, and this year the Browns lead the league in single possession wins. I think the most important defensive stat that I've heard is that the Browns have the most 3-and-outs forced like in 20 years or something, which is just mind-boggling. But when you think about it, this team does not have a run game anymore. They're down to their 5th and 6th tackles. They're down to, Jerome Ford was a guy that was supposed to get 5 carries a game this year. Kareem Hunt is not who we believe Kareem Hunt was based off of his stats 3 and 4 years ago. He's a guy averaging 2 yards a carry. So this is a team that running out the clock is going to be difficult. You're kind of hoping more screen passes, get to guys in space, or 5 to 7 yard passes are how you're going to chew up clock. But it helps a lot when the defense is able to spend 90 seconds on the field and force a punt, so that way you can still have that control of the clock. Because controlling the clock is how you win playoff games, and that's where you said, do you expect to make a Super Bowl run? I don't know with this running game that you can make a Super Bowl run, because you saw it this week twice. When you got to run the ball and they know that you're running the ball, you're going to average a yard a carry. And sometimes you just need 3 first downs so you don't kick it to Patrick Mahomes, or sometimes you need 2 first downs to close out a game against the Eagles and Hurts. So I think week 1, if you're in where you're at right now, and let's face it, the Steelers and the Dolphins both beating the Ravens has to happen for the Browns to get the 1 seed, right? You're either in the 1st seed or the 5th seed. They have the tiebreakers and all the wild cards in place, so they're either the 5th or the 1st seed. Those are the only 2 options. One's probably not happening, and personally, I prefer to rest starters next week than hey, let's play the starters and hope the Ravens lose to a bad Steelers team this year. But I think you're playing Trevor Lawrence, or you're playing I think CJ Stroud, right? Like I don't know that Indianapolis has a fantastic shot at it with what they've got, but even if you do, like the Browns have actually beaten all 3 of those teams. So I would personally think that week 1, that's got to be a win, even though you're on the road. But after that, you're on the road, right? Unless you're playing Buffalo, that's kind of your only chance, is Buffalo beats another team if they don't win the division, because I think they can still win the division right now. So yeah, I think week 1 you got to win. After that, like you said, house money. If it happens, that's fantastic. If not, next year you got a healthy Nick Chubb. I think Dwayne Jones, or the big right tackle from Ohio State, I think he might be the best pick they had this year. He mauls people in the run game. He's been great in the pass game. Now you need to find a left tackle to pair along him, because I don't think they re-signed Jedrick Wills after this year. But I think there's a lot of really good things to build off this season.
You teased Buffalo and Miami potentially switching places in the playoff seeding. I've kind of been looking into that as well. Miami plays Baltimore this week. We know how good the Ravens are. And then Miami finishes their season against Buffalo. And I do agree that that's your best chance of having a deep playoff run, would be if one of those 2 teams knocks off Kansas City and you end up getting a home playoff game in that 2nd round. I'm tempted, though, to say you might almost want to face Kansas City instead, just because
looking broken the last couple of weeks. You're not wrong.
Yeah, they've struggled the last handful of weeks. They're 3-5 in their last 8 games, which isn't exactly a comforting stretch to have if you're a Chiefs fan. But the Browns, they're plus 3,700 odds on FanDuel Sportsbook right now for those of you who partake in sports betting. I think it's worth a sprinkle. I won't pick them as my favorite, but they've been proving people wrong all year. And if you can have a game or 2 in the playoffs where you keep things going and the team continues to build around Flacco and mold that offense around his skill set, I think the ceiling of this Browns team has yet to be seen. certainly it feels that way. I mean, Flacco's only been quarterbacking the team for 5 weeks. And that first week, he came right off the couch. So it's not like he had a ton of time to get familiar with the playbook and his players. Sure, he played with Elijah Moore previously, but you have Amari Cooper having a franchise record day 2 weeks ago. Then David Njoku absolutely goes off against New York on Thursday night. You can't expect performances like that every week, but I'm starting to feel like maybe we should almost from this Flacco offense. I mean, the landscape of quarterbacks in the league, there aren't many guys right now playing at his level. There's a handful, but I would say right now, Flacco's certainly in that top half of the league in terms of quarterbacks, just not necessarily overall like resume and everything like that, but how he's playing right now today. I would definitely say so.
I think he's got the hot hand. I don't think he's January Flacco from his Super Bowl run. I think there he went like 17 touchdowns and 0 interceptions on that run or something. Like, I don't think you see that performance out of him this year, but that was also, 10 years ago. And I think one thing that's like really overlooked is just how well he's able to manage the guys. One thing that worries me, I'm not sure if you saw the report this morning, Elijah Moore's doctor recommended he retire after that concussion on Thursday night. So I don't know how that works out, but I'm one of those people that say he's got to do what's best for him. Like zero bad blood if he decides to take the money and run. If he decides to play, I'll still root for him, even though it's dangerous according to what this concussion doctor is saying. Same thing as Tua, right? Like they need to do what they want to do with their life. It's their body, not mine. But if the doctor is saying he recommends he retires, I imagine we're not seeing Elijah Moore on a football field, at least this year, right? Like maybe next year, but certainly not in a playoff run here. So the question is, how bad is that heel for Amari Cooper? Because the offense looks really different without those two receivers in. After that, Cedric Tillman's your top guy. But I mean, you mentioned Njoku. If you go back in like my Twitter 3 years, which would take forever to do, you'll see. I remember having a conversation with some Steelers fans about how I thought Njoku was the best tight end in the division, and he just didn't have someone to throw it to him. Like he's hyper athletic. I mean, the one thing that worries me about him is that he loves leaving his feet to jump over people, and I hate that from big-bodied players. But I mean, he's finally catching the ball. The first couple of years, that was the worry with him, was he had trouble catching and holding on to the ball. But this guy, once he gets it, he moves in space, and he's like, having Darren Sproles. He's shifty with a big body. Now, Sproles was probably a foot shorter than him, but same thing, like had that wide build where it's like he could run you over or he could run around you.
Last question for you. And this is more a tease towards next season for Cleveland. Now is there a quarterback competition now going into next season? I mean, obviously Flacco will be a free agent, and you mentioned he may have options elsewhere where he can start right away. But if you're Cleveland, if you do make a deep playoff run and Flacco is the guy that's helping you to do that, what percentage chance between 0 and 100 would you say that Joe Flacco is the starting quarterback in 2024 for Cleveland?
I think it's the same percentage chance as if he wants to sign with Cleveland, right? Cleveland doesn't have the big dollars to give to him. Like Aaron Rodgers went to New York and still got the big dollars, right? Like, so if he's willing to say, hey, let's run it back and let's try it again, and signs for a team-friendly discount because he understands that the defense is elite, because he likes working with the receivers in the room or whatever, I think there's a high chance. I think the other thing to consider is, although Deshaun Watson doesn't have the gaudy stats, Deshaun Watson was 5-1 this year. Last year, his record wasn't the same, but this year he went 5-1 with the same defense. And granted, he went 5-1 with two of those wins having Nick Chubb running for. He was leading the league by over 100 yards after 6 quarters. So, Nick Chubb is certainly a really big part of how this offense flows once he's back in it, and he'll be in a contract year next year. I would hope that Cleveland locks him up, because I'd love for him to be a lifelong Brown, regardless of how his health and the remainder of his career shakes out. I just hate to see him in another uniform based off of him just being a consummate professional, guy that, doesn't talk to the media unless it's good things about his team. He puts his head down and, is quietly the best running back in the league. And I don't think it's particularly close, right? Like people talked about Derrick Henry for a while, but you compare those two stats, and there's one guy who's clearly done better in the games that he's played. I think Jonathan Taylor with this whole holdout thing ruined a lot of his legacy.
John Kocsis, ladies and gentlemen, Columbia Fireflies play-by-play broadcaster, also an author, recently published. You've got a book out currently, play-by-play from the minors, profiles of baseball broadcasters from Scranton to Yakima. You've got a good bit of experience doing play-by-play in the minor leagues. You and I both have some stories we can share from that, which I would love to delve into on a future episode. But you can find that book on Amazon. Are there any other services or publication locations where some of our listeners can find that book?
Yeah, it's on McFarland Books. You can do special orders where it's on the website for Books A Million as well as Barnes and Noble. And then if you're in Columbia, it's at All Good Books on Hardin Road in person. If you're not a fan of the online shopping, it is in a brick and mortar store.
Awesome. John, thanks for coming on, my man. I've enjoyed talking some Browns football with you. I've been a fan of this Cleveland team from the beginning of the year, and I'm glad to see them having some success. I hope they can finish the year strong.
Yeah, hopefully they can do us proud. Thanks for having me, man. This was a blast to chat, and look forward to seeing this in future episodes.
Absolutely. All right, ladies and gentlemen, John Kocsis, once again from the Columbia Fireflies. Stick around. We've got some Yoshinobu Yamamoto talk coming around the corner, as well as some college football playoff previews as well. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of the show.